Welcome to a Viking wedding, where love wasn't just a matter of the heart, but a strategic negotiation involving swords, pigs, and, well, some traditions that would make any modern person blush with embarrassment. Hey guys, tonight before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. Let's get started. Engagement began with livestock negotiations. Long before thinking about flowers or rings, Vikings treated marriage like a sophisticated commercial transaction. The bride's father didn't ask, "Do you love my daughter?" but rather, "How many cows can you offer?" The munder, the bride price, could include everything from cattle and land to slaves and precious weapons. The value wasn't fixed and depended on many factors: the bride's beauty, her domestic skills, her ability to bear children, and especially her family's social status. A jarl's nobleman's daughter could cost the equivalent of 20 cows, while a common peasant girl cost about 3 to 5 cows. To put this in perspective, 1 cow was worth approximately what a worker earned in an entire year. But here's the interesting part. It wasn't just the man who paid. The bride's family also offered a hymen filgia, a dowry that often included bedding, jewelry, property, and even ships. Some wealthy families would include specialized slaves, like goldsmiths or blacksmiths. The most fascinating part is that these negotiations could last for months, with back and forth bargaining like peace negotiations between kingdoms. There are records of fathers who traveled hundreds of kilometers to personally inspect the offered cattle, checking the animal's health, the quality of the lands, and even testing the sharpness of swords. It was like a medieval audit, but with matrimonial consequences. If the cattle died before the wedding, the engagement could be automatically cancelled. Imagine explaining that to the guests. The family sword was more important than the ring. Forget diamond rings. In Viking culture, the groom presented the bride with an ancestral family sword, not for her to use in battle, but to keep and pass on to future male children. It was a symbol that she was now part of the family's warrior lineage. These weren't ordinary weapons. Many had their own names, like Bonebiter or Flame of the North, and their stories were passed down orally from generation to generation. Some were over 200 years old, and carried magical runes engraved on their blades. The most famous sword ever recorded, called Gram, supposedly belonged to the hero Sigurd, and had the power to cut an anvil in half. In return, the bride offered the groom the keys to the house, literally. These keys were attached to her belt and represented her new role as lady of the household. But they weren't just decorative keys. They opened treasure chests, pantries, weapon cabinets, and even domestic prisons where slaves were kept. Carrying these keys meant having complete control over the domestic economy. The handover ritual was solemn and public. The sword was presented in an ornate leather case, and the keys were blessed by a Gothi Viking priest before the exchange. If the bride rejected the sword or keys, the marriage was considered null. Imagine trying to explain this to a modern jeweler. "No thank you, we don't want wedding rings. We have a 200-year-old medieval sword with magical powers and a set of keys that control the domestic economy." The bride running ritual. Here's where things get interesting. In some regions, there was a tradition called brúðhlaup, literally bride running, where the bride had to run from her parents' house to her future husband's house. This wasn't a symbolic run, it was a real race, often through forests, fields, icy rivers, and mountains. The distance could vary from a few kilometers to epic journeys of more than 15 kilometers. The bride ran wearing her finest wedding clothes, including heavy wool cloaks, bronze jewelry, and sometimes even decorative chainmail that could weigh up to 10 kilograms. It was like running a marathon while wearing armor. The symbolism was clear. The bride was literally running toward her new life, demonstrating determination and commitment. But there were also practical and competitive elements. If she arrived before sunset, it was considered a sign of good luck for the marriage. If she arrived after nightfall, some interpreted it as hesitation or lack of enthusiasm. The most fascinating part is that the bride didn't run alone. She was accompanied by an entourage of unmarried women from the family, who ran alongside her singing traditional songs and carrying torches if necessary. It was like a medieval marathon with a female choir. During the run, natural obstacles were considered tests from the gods. If the bride stumbled on a rock, it was a sign that Loki was testing her determination. If she crossed a stream without getting her feet wet, Thor was blessing the union. Imagine the guests cheering, "Run, Astrid, your future husband is waiting, and watch out for that rock, it might be Loki." The ritual bath, which wasn't optional. Vikings took hygiene very seriously, especially at weddings. Both bride and groom had to undergo an elaborate ritual bath before the ceremony. But this wasn't an ordinary bath. It was a community event that could last all day. The older women of the family supervised the bride's bath, while the men did the same for the groom. The location was usually a special bathhouse called Bogstofa, built specifically for these rituals. It was considered both physical and spiritual purification, removing not just dirt, but also any bad luck or curses. The strangest part? They used ashes from specific woods mixed with herbs to create a cleaning paste. The ashes came exclusively from oak or ash trees, sacred trees in Norse mythology. The mixture included lavender for purity, thyme for courage, and even crushed moss that supposedly had magical protective properties. The process was meticulous. First, the entire body was scrubbed with this abrasive paste, then rinsed with water heated in special cauldrons, infused with rose petals and honey. Finally, the hair was washed with a mixture of egg yolk, beer, and aromatic oils. The resulting smell was peculiar. Throughout the entire process, the supervisors recited protection spells and sang traditional songs. If anyone got a word of the song wrong, the bath had to start over from the beginning. No perfumed soaps or shampoos, just ashes, herbs, eggs, beer, and lots of tradition. It was like a medieval spa, but with more superstition and less comfort. The sacred shoe exchange. This is one of the most peculiar traditions. During the ceremony, the couple exchanged shoes. Not temporarily, permanently. The groom would wear the bride's shoes for the rest of his life, and she would wear his. And we're not talking about delicate little slippers. We're talking about thick leather boots, often with iron studs for traction on ice. The symbolism was deep and multifaceted. They were literally walking in each other's shoes, demonstrating mutual understanding and unity. But it also represented an exchange of perspectives. The man would experience the world from the woman's point of view, and vice versa. It was a lesson in empathy codified in leather and iron. But it was also highly practical. In a society where shoes were expensive, rare, and valuable, it was a real exchange of property. Viking shoes were handmade by specialized craftsmen, using leather from specific animals. Men's shoes were usually made from ox leather for durability, while women's used goat leather for flexibility. The exchange ceremony was complex. First, the shoes were blessed with sheep's blood. Then, each spouse had to walk 3 steps in the other's shoes while reciting specific vows. If anyone stumbled during those 3 steps, it was considered a bad omen for the marriage. The most interesting part is that the exchanged shoes became protective amulets. Many Viking wives buried their husbands' original shoes under the house threshold to protect the family from evil spirits. And there was a strange rule. If the marriage ended in divorce, the shoes had to be returned to their original owners. Imagine trying to explain this to a modern wedding planner. Yes, we need a shoe exchange ceremony blessed with sheep's blood, and we want a return clause in case of divorce. The Viking veil. Why brides didn't wear veils? Here's something that will shock anyone who has ever organized a wedding. Viking brides didn't wear veils. Nothing. Zero torchi. While other European cultures were already adopting veils as symbols of purity and modesty, Viking women did exactly the opposite. In fact, wearing a veil was considered a sign of weakness or submission. Everything a Viking woman definitely didn't want to demonstrate. In a society where women could ask for divorce, own property, and even lead armies, covering one's face was seen as a denial of identity and strength. Instead, they wore their hair in elaborate braids decorated with colored silk ribbons, silver and gold jewelry, and even small protective amulets made of bone and amber. These braids weren't just decorative, they told a story. The number of braids indicated the bride's social status. while the amulets represented her personal achievements. Some brides would wear up to 20 different braids, each representing an aspect of their lives: family, skills, properties, even defeated enemies. It was like a complex hair curriculum. The ribbons were dyed in specific colors: red for courage, blue for wisdom, gold for wealth. Loose, visible hair was a symbol of fertility, independence, and connection to the Norse goddesses. Freya and Freya, fertility deities, were always depicted with long, free-flowing hair. Covering the hair would be like denying this divine connection. But there's a practical reason too. In a society where women worked in fields, handled weapons, sailed ships, and fought alongside men, a veil would be more of an obstacle than decoration. It was like trying to fight the wind using a curtain on your head. Impractical and dangerous. There's a historical record of a Viking bride who was forced to wear a veil due to Christian influence, and she removed it during the ceremony, declaring that a woman of the north hides her face from no one, neither gods nor men. The crowd applauded, and the veil tradition was never mentioned again in that region. The flower crown ritual. For both bride and groom wore flower crowns during the ceremony, but these crowns were far more complex than any modern floral arrangement. Each flower had a specific and magical meaning: red roses for passionate love, lavender for purity and protection, rosemary for memory and fidelity, daisies for new beginnings, and elderflowers for protection against evil spirits. The most interesting part is that these crowns were made exclusively by unmarried women from the community, who wove their own hopes and wishes into the flowers. Each unmarried woman contributed a specific flower, whispering a secret wish for the couple while intertwining it into the crown. It was like a bouquet of collective wishes. The construction of the crowns began at dawn on the wedding day. Women gathered in a sacred field and collected flowers still covered with dew, as it was believed that morning dew carried blessings from the gods. The flowers had to be picked in a specific order. First the flowers of love, then those of protection, and lastly those of fertility. The most fascinating part is that the crowns were different for each season. Spring weddings used daffodils and wild tulips, while autumn weddings incorporated oak leaves and juniper berries. Winter weddings, the rarest, used pine branches and mistletoe, considered sacred by the Norse gods. During the ceremony, the couple had to keep the crowns balanced on their heads without using their hands. If a crown fell, it was a sign that person wasn't fully committed to the marriage. After the ceremony, the crowns were burned together in a sacred fire, symbolizing that the two were now a single entity. The ashes were mixed with honey and buried under the threshold of the couple's new home. It was like ancient Instagram, but with fire, magic, and serious matrimonial consequences. The magic love drink. Mead wasn't just a beverage. It was considered a literal magic potion, and its preparation for weddings was a ritual that could take months. The couple had to drink from a shared horn during the ceremony, but the mead was special, fermented with honey from bees that supposedly had visited only specific and sacred flowers. The recipe was closely guarded by families and passed from mother to daughter. The base honey came from hives located in sacred groves, where only century-old trees were permitted. The bees had to have visited exclusively linden, acacia, and white clover flowers, flowers associated with fertility and lasting love. Some families added secret magical ingredients to the mead: valerian root to calm wedding nerves, Siberian ginseng for the honeymoon, rose petals to intensify love, and even small amounts of hallucinogenic mushrooms to connect the couple to the spiritual world. It was like a liquid medieval pharmacy. The horn used in the ceremony was also special. It had to come from an aurochs, a giant wild ox now extinct, that had been hunted by the groom's father or grandfather. The horn was decorated with protection runes and fertility symbols, and there was a strict rule. The couple had to completely drain the horn without stopping, without dropping a drop, and without making a face. This was harder than it sounds, as the horn could hold up to 2 liters of mead. Often, the couple would finish the ceremony completely intoxicated, which led to the Norse expression drunk on love, which was originally literal, not metaphorical. If any drop fell to the ground during the ritual, It was interpreted as a sign that the marriage would be spilled, meaning it would end in separation. Therefore, wealthy families hired a horn holder, a strong man whose only function was to ensure the horn didn't fall from the trembling hands of intoxicated couples. It was like a toast that came with side effects and accident insurance. The bride's strength test. Before the ceremony, the bride had to demonstrate her physical strength through a series of tasks that would make any modern personal trainer tremble. This wasn't cruelty or machismo. It was a matter of pure survival in a world where physical strength meant the difference between living and dying. The test began at dawn with the lifting of Thor's hammer. The bride had to carry an iron war hammer weighing between 8 to 12 kilograms for a distance of 100 steps. It wasn't the god Thor's hammer, but it was blessed in his name and symbolized the ability to defend the home. Next came the water test. She had to lift and carry a barrel full of water for 50 steps. The barrel weighed about 40 kilograms when full, and the water couldn't spill. This demonstrated that she would be capable of fetching water from distant wells during sieges or droughts. The third challenge was the board breaking. Using only her hands, she had to break an oak board 2 centimeters thick. This wasn't just about brute strength, but about technique and determination, essential qualities for a Viking woman. The final test was the most bizarre: the groom lifting. The bride had to lift her future husband off the ground and carry him for at least 5 steps. Considering that Viking warriors averaged 80 kilograms, this was an impressive demonstration of strength. If she could carry the groom for more than 10 steps, it was considered a sign of extreme good luck. It wasn't cruelty, it was practicality. Viking life was hard, and women needed to be strong to survive. They worked in fields, defended homes during raids, cared for large and heavy animals, and even fought in battles when necessary. A bride who couldn't prove her physical strength could be considered a bad investment for a family that depended on physical labor for survival. If the bride failed any test, the marriage wasn't canceled, but the bride price was reduced proportionally. It was like a medieval fitness test, but with direct matrimonial and financial consequences. The mixed blood ceremony. This tradition will make you completely rethink cutting the wedding cake. The couple made small cuts in their palms using a sacred knife called sea axe, and let the blood drip into a special bowl made from elk horn, mixed with sacred earth from a grove dedicated to Odin. But the ceremony was much more elaborate than that. First, the knife had to be purified with fire and water, while a gothy Viking priest recited protection spells. The earth in the bowl came from specific locations, a handful from where the groom was born, another from where the bride was born, and a third from a battlefield where family ancestors had fought. After the mixed blood dripped into the earth, the couple had to mix everything with their wounded hands, creating a dark red paste. Then, they rubbed this mixture on each other's faces, on the forehead, cheeks, and chin. The specific pattern depended on the region. Some families made rune-shaped marks, others created totem animal symbols. The symbolism was powerful on multiple layers. They were literally sharing life, mixing their vital essences. But it was also a blood oath. Breaking the marriage meant breaking a sacred bond made before the gods. In Viking cosmology, blood was considered the seat of the soul, so mixing blood meant mixing souls. The blood and earth paste was left to dry on their faces during the rest of the ceremony, creating a temporary ritual mask. Only after the final vows could they wash their faces in a basin of blessed water with rose petals. The most interesting part is that the bowl, with the remaining bloody earth, was buried under the couple's house threshold. This was believed to create a permanent magical connection between the couple and the land, ensuring fertility and prosperity. If the marriage ended, the bowl had to be dug up and ritually broken. It was romantic in a very medieval and bloody way. Imagine trying to explain this to a modern wedding planner. Yes, we want a blood-mixing ceremony with sacred earth from battlefields, and we need someone to officialize the cuts with a fire-purified knife. The honeymoon lasted exactly 1 lunar month. The Viking honeymoon wasn't a trip to a tropical resort with beach cocktails. It was a period of ritual isolation that lasted exactly 1 complete lunar cycle, about 29 days, and followed rules stricter than a medieval monastery. The couple stayed in a special cabin built specifically for the honeymoon, called Husbili Husband's House. This cabin had to be built by the groom and his friends at least a month before the wedding, using wood from only 3 types of trees. Oak for strength, ash for protection, and linden for love. The cabin couldn't have windows, only an opening in the roof to observe the moon's phases. During this period, they were completely separated from the rest of the community. No one could see them, speak to them, or even know how they were doing. Food was left in a special basket outside the door every day at dawn by women from the bride's family, who had to approach in absolute silence. And here comes the interesting part about the diet. They were fed exclusively on meat and honey during the first week, hence the name honeymoon. The second week included sweet bread and dried fruits. The third week, smoked meats and cheeses. The fourth week, a normal diet was gradually reintroduced. The idea was that honey would make them more fertile and strengthen their bond through a kind of sweet fasting. But there were bizarre rules. The couple couldn't leave the cabin during the day, only at night for basic necessities. They had to sleep in a single bed made of bearskin, and they had to wake up always at sunrise to observe the waning moon in the sky if visible. The strangest was the counting ritual. Each day, they had to make a mark on a wooden stick to count the passing days. If they lost count, they had to restart the honeymoon from 0. There were recorded cases of couples who remained isolated for more than 2 months because they kept losing count. Throughout the entire period, neighbors and family left small gifts in the food basket. Protection amulets, simple jewelry, household tools, and seeds to plant when the isolation ended. It was like a reality show, but with more privacy, honey, and a touch of monastic seclusion. At the end of 29 days, the couple emerged from the cabin in a ceremony called Yuska Parblat, marriage sacrifice, where they presented to the community any child that might have been conceived during isolation. If the wife was pregnant, it was considered the greatest possible sign of good luck. If she wasn't, well, they would have to try again next year with another month of isolation. Looking at these strange and fascinating traditions, it's impossible not to reflect on how love and marriage have evolved over the centuries. Vikings didn't have dating apps or couples therapy, but they had something we might have lost. Deep and meaningful rituals that strengthen not just the bond between 2 people, but between families and entire communities. Their ceremonies might seem strange or brutal to us, but they were full of symbolism and purpose. Each tradition served to test, strengthen, and celebrate the union of 2 lives. It was pragmatic love, yes, but it was also deep love. Love that understood marriage wasn't just about feelings, but about survival, family, and legacy. Perhaps the most important lesson we can learn from Vikings is that true love isn't just about romance and passion. It's about commitment, strength, and the willingness to literally walk in each other's shoes. In a world where half of marriages end in divorce, maybe we can learn something from people who took their marriage vows so seriously that they sealed them with blood. Now, as you settle in to sleep tonight, I want you to think, if you were to marry like a Viking, which of these traditions would you find most difficult to fulfill? The run through the forest? Drinking mead from a horn? Or perhaps mixing blood with your partner? And more importantly, what do these traditions teach us about the commitment and seriousness with which Vikings approached marriage? Can our modern marriages, with all their convenience and comfort, create bonds as strong as those sealed with swords, blood, and forest run? Let these reflections warm your mind as you drift off to sleep, knowing that somewhere in history, Viking couples were proving that true love sometimes requires a bit of courage, lots of strength, and the willingness to share even the strangest of rituals. Good night, and may your dreams be populated by northern warriors celebrating love in the most epic way possible.